This is the Ancient Medieval History lesson for Friday, June 3rd, 2022. And we left off talking about Welsh yeoman longbowmen in the Hundred Years' War. The act of drawing a longbow is physically demanding. You've got a weapon that has a pull on average between 125 and 175 pounds, or average 150. You've got to pull the arrow back and hold it until you're ready to shoot, and then you release, and the arrow goes down range. Now, a normal, healthy man can draw and shoot an arrow from a longbow, even if they're not practiced once or twice or three times. But the sheer uniqueness of the physical motion is going to make them tired. They're going to overstress muscles that they don't normally use in everyday life very, very quickly. The key to being a good longbowman is not only being able to take an arrow and shoot it from your bow, but to hit something with it, the thing you want it to hit. So that involves control. A good longbowman can shoot once every, a good controlled shot, maybe once every 10 seconds. But that kind of fire after the first couple of shots is not really aimed. So if you are in a large formation of bowmen and you are shooting volleys, the unit can send a storm of arrows downrange strong enough to penetrate most body armor and kill a number of targets, causing panic, breaking up their formation, or forcing them to hunker down and wait for the arrow storm to pass. But unlike in that movie, that 300, the arrows are not just shot once, they're shot again and again and again. So it takes a lifetime of training to become proficient. Welshmen and Englishmen from the West Midlands start practicing at least an hour or two a day, every day, except maybe the occasional feast day or when you're really, really sick. From the time they're about 7. Now, obviously, a 7-year-old is not going to be able to pull a 150-pound bow. So you start small and you work your way up to a real yew longbow. Y-E-W-U, were very stiff, very good for the longbow. But when we exhume skeletons of yeomen, which is another word for longbowmen, we see that their bones are fused in an unusual way, a distinctive way. And they also have bone masses that are also not typical. Because as they're growing up, their body is deformed in order to operate the bow more effectively. Now, you see this in certain African tribes where girls put a little plate in their lower lip, and every year the plate gets bigger. And so what happens is you end up with tribes where girls have these massive plate lips as adults, or where other girls in different African tribes start wearing a series of neck rings. And slowly over time, the neck gets longer and longer, so you end up with a human being with a neck this long. Or Chinese women that are noble women So their feet are bound from the time they're little girls, bound tightly, tightly, tightly in cloth, so that as the rest of their body grows up normally, they have these adult female bodies with little tiny child feet. The human body is quite flexible. There are some tribes that have bigger and bigger earrings, so without earrings, they have these floppy lobes that hang down to here. The Welsh longbowman is actually deformed the way these other people are, but in a far more functional way. At least what they're doing has an actual practical use. So, in these wars, the French knights outnumber the English knights significantly. Heavy cavalry has ruled the battlefield since really the fall of the Roman Empire. And as time has gone on, heavy cavalry has gotten heavier. Knights have gotten more heavily armored. Their horses have gotten more large and bulky and muscular. They've given up mobility, in a sense, for armor. Although there is nothing quite so powerful as 300 armored knights charging with their Clydesdale horses at you with lances. You do not want to be on the receiving end of that. Nothing in the Middle Ages, anyway. So the French have an advantage early on and throughout the war in terms of their knights. And again, this is a question of who will control France. Will it be the King of England? Will it be the King of France? Will it be somebody else later on, the Duke of Burgundy? And at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, French knights are approaching, 3 battles of them, 3 formations of French knights, front, middle, and back, which is the way they usually form up, are going to head towards a group of English soldiers. But in the woods on either side of their anticipated path of attack are the longbowmen. And as the French battles of knights, their formations of knights, get closer, the longbowmen begin their fire from both sides as they approach. And hundreds of French knights are killed quickly. Their formations break up. The force of the attack breaks up. They are not able to continue. They're not able to defeat a much smaller English force because they can't get close enough in sufficient numbers to crush the English under their horses' hooves. At Crécy in 1346, the English longbowman is revealed to the world as a game changer, the kind of soldier that will make the old approaches to battle just not work. Now, the battles range back and forth, but there is a change in the early 1410s. There's a new English king, King Henry V. And Henry V is young, he's energetic, he's ambitious, he thinks he can win the war, and he will do so by encouraging the French to think they have an advantage and attacking him when they think they have an advantage. So, Henry draws a superior French army after him, and in 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt, faces them. Now, Shakespeare wrote a series of historical plays, one of which is Henry V. And in this story, King Harry, as he's called, is interested in making sure that his men are ready for battle. And he wonders if they understand why he's making them fight and what he's about. So the night before the battle, he puts on a disguise as a common soldier in the play and goes from campsite to campsite, listening to what they have to say about him, about the battle, because they never tell him to his face because he's their king. But in talk to one another, soldiers always complain. You can always get a sense of the problems that soldiers have because they always talk about them. So let me see. Okay. Lights, please. Hold on. I'm going to have a copyright strike. God forbid. This is from Kenneth Branagh's 1994 or whatever, 1989 version of Henry V. Being literate people, presumably you followed that. The king is before this battle that he has arranged. The king, Henry V, looking back on generations of this 100 Years' War, inconclusive battles, begs for peace of mind, envies his servants who don't have to worry that their plans will go awry, will doom a nation, will doom thousands of men to useless deaths. Envies a slave his day of labor and his night of Elysium-like sleep. And then begs God, almost like Jesus in Gethsemane, for his good grace. Having done all of this, Shakespeare has Henry present something to his men that hopefully he believes will inspire them in the coming battle. I try.
We should go on the trick show.
We hoot few, we happy few, we band of brothers. That is probably the most famous pre-battle speech in all of human fiction. Did Henry V say that or anything like it before the Battle of Agincourt? Who knows? But what we do know is that he was a charismatic leader. He was the kind of leader that led men into battle. He didn't just command that they go. He actually went himself. And at Agincourt, despite 5-1 odds, Henry's army prevails. The King of France abdicates after Henry marries his daughter, the Princess Royale. Henry is now king of England and France. His wife is queen of France and England. Henry has won the 100 Years' War because of the Battle of Agincourt. And then he dies!
Oh, wow.
Almost immediately. And with his death comes the unraveling of the English victory. And with that unraveling, a new chapter. Because the English are on the rise, the English have all the advantages after this, but still they're having to fight once again. And into this mix arrives a girl in her early to mid-teens, a peasant girl, you can stop the squeakery, named Joan.
Wow.
Now, she claims that she has been spoken to personally by the Virgin Mary and by our Lord in order to tell her how to tell the French how to achieve the victory God wants for the French. And she is also charismatic in a very different way from Henry V. She has the ability to be believable. Young maiden, innocent, pure, and touched by God. The decision is made to make a suit of armor that will fit her for show and send her to Orleans, which is under siege by the British. Joan arrives at the head of a French army, fired up and inspired by her seemingly holy words, and her army breaks the siege of Orleans and then goes on to achieve a series of unexpected victories. For the first time since before Agincourt, the English are on their back foot. The English are not setting the tone. They're not setting the pace of battle. The English are losing. So the English get a hold of her. They capture her. I mean it. It's annoying, and it doesn't have to happen. So pull the table away or apart or whatever. Here, I'll help.
Just take it apart.
Yeah, that's something too. Just boom. There. Slide your table out.
What?
Muscle.
Slide your table out.
Just
this way.
start
Just
breaking
a
the
little bit.
table.
Good. Keep them separate. That might make it easier. Or you can move. I'm not saying you're being a bad person or anything. I just don't want to hear it.
Just destroy the table. Boom.
Yeah, there we go. That's an option. If anyone does it, I will. So I've had to live with these tables for years. So, the English claim that she is not receiving messages from God. That in fact, she is receiving messages from demons and the devil. That she is a witch, a charlatan. And they put her on trial for her life, find her guilty of witchcraft, and burn her at the stake. However, her inspiration continues to inspire the French, even more so now that she has been martyred. The Roman Catholic Church, which is strongly part of the French kingdom, names her a saint, Saint Joan of Arc. The French win the 100 Years' War, in part because of the inspiration of Saint Joan of Arc. Now, what does this mean? Well, in fact, this is good for England. Because this obsession that has been there since William the Conqueror up through the end of the 100 Years' War, which is actually closer to 500 years, well, 400 years, about ruling France, has distracted every one of these kings to some degree. And this distraction is at England's expense. England is basically being used as a giant bag of resources. For what? To conquer another country. After the defeat in the 100 Years' War, England will stop trying to make itself the continental power of England, France, and instead will devote itself to fully absorbing Wales, dealing with the Scots, which is ultimately resolved in the Union in the early 1700s between the Scottish and English crowns, and conquer Ireland. And with the domination of the British Isles, England will then go out in the Age of Discovery to establish what will become the largest empire in human history, the British Empire, from which we, as Americans, derive. American institutions don't come from Germany. They don't come from the American Indians. They come from England. So England's defeat rededicates the kings of England to the good and well-being that England is. In other words, the top priority of the English kings is the nation of England and a growing empire around it and then overseas. So, any questions on the 100 Years' War before we go into the next bit of English history? Just around the time of the resolution of the 100 Years' War, a dynastic dispute develops within the English monarchy. Who will become king? And ultimately there is a split, and the country engages in its first full-scale civil war since the Norman conquest. It's called the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses is called such because you have two houses, House Lancaster and House York. Now, if you're at all familiar with the old HBO fantasy show Game of Thrones, the writer, George R.R. Martin, based a lot of the initial stuff in Game of Thrones on the War of the Roses, to the extent that there is a house of Lannister, not Lancaster, and Stark, not York. But basically, it's the same thing. One of them has the symbol of a red rose, one of them has the symbol of a white rose. And these guys fight it out, and there's some pretty nasty stuff, including the ultimate reign of the last opponent of the victor of the Wars of the Rose, King Richard III. Richard III is portrayed by Shakespeare as a scene-chewing, mustache-twirling villain. The kind of guy who would kill his nephews, and does, without batting an eye. A guy with a hunchback, well, that's not something Shakespeare leads with, and a clubbed foot, and a speech impediment. And none of these things are used because instead he has to be a plausible villain. Now is the winter of our discontent. Made glorious summer by the House of York is the famous introduction to Richard III in the eponymous play. And as the Yorkists and Lancastrians are fighting back and forth, they annihilate each other almost totally. Richard III seems triumphant. He rules England for several years in what is depicted by Shakespeare and others as a reign of terror. Finally, an ally of the Yorkists, Henry Tudor, arrives in England with a new army from overseas. Henry Tudor, though a Tudor and not a York, takes up the Yorkist cause, and at the Battle of Bosworth Field, meets and beats Richard III. In Shakespeare's play, famously, Richard is unhorsed and is wandering around shouting, "My horse! A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" Ultimately, this evil, satanic villain of villains, again, according to Shakespeare, is defeated by Henry Tudor, and the Wars of the Roses are finally over. So there's a 1-2 punch for England. Actually, 1-2-3 punch, because there's the 100 Years' War, there's the plague early in the 100 Years' War, then England loses the 100 Years' War, then there's the War of the Roses right on its heels. So England has this ongoing period from the mid-1300s to the late 1400s, about 150 years of ongoing turmoil. But the result is King Henry VII is crowned. His symbol is a mixed rose, red and white. And England is now going to be under the Tudor monarchy. And his son, Henry VIII, is going to be very important when we start next year and talk about England during early modern Europe, and his daughter Elizabeth. Yes, and the wives, which I have on a mug because students gave it to me. And this mug, has all the pictures of the wives, and if you pour hot water into the mug for coffee or tea or whatever, the wives disappear in the order that Henry killed them, or that they died, or divorced them. Yeah. I have it. I have it over here. It's behind Nomi Nixon, which was given me. Let's see. Yeah. So here you got all the faces of his wives.
My wife has a beard.
And no, that's Henry. He's not a dwarf. He doesn't have dwarf women with beards. And so all of these faces just wink out one by one by one. It's really, it's sick, but it's I like it. It's kind of cool. And since I don't really drink tea or coffee, I just use it for holding pens and pencils and things. But it's one of the nicer things.
Killed all his wives, right?
Well, he divorced some. He killed some, and some of them died.
He divorced Catherine of Aragon, he killed Anne Boleyn,
No.
he married Jane Seymour, who died
killed
in
his
childbirth.
He killed his wives. I'll bring the hammer.
Yeah, did you know this?
Yes,
He divorced,
we have somebody who actually knows the details. Go.
he divorced Catherine of Aragon,
Yeah.
killed Anne Boleyn, married Jane Seymour, who died during childbirth, then then was looking into, what's her name? Anna of Cleves, who,
You got them all on here if you want something to remind you of names.
yeah,
Not that I think you need it.
Anna of Cleves, who he, did a long-distance marriage with, and then he actually saw her in person, he's like, you're ugly, no. And then he killed his next wife, Catherine Howard, and then, he died before, Catherine,
It's on there.
the very last.
Yeah.
Her, Catherine Parr. And then she survived when he died.
Yeah, 'cause I thought he went to the church and said, I want to divorce my wife. And
Catherine of Aragon.
They said no,
And then
and
they
that
went,
was
no.
yeah.
do that. And he went, oh, okay, and so he just killed him.
No, he
No,
went, oh, okay, Church of England.
Yeah.
He separated. So if you are an Episcopalian, your church comes from the Church of England, which is a church that was founded so that Henry VIII could get a divorce,
Yeah.
which is kind of funny, in a sick sort of way. But though I experimented with Episcopalianism, decided it wasn't for me. So maybe I'm just being mean-spirited. Okay. So what we will do next time is we will talk about the rest of Europe in the late Middle Ages, and we will get us closer to the actual very end of the year. Thank you for your attention. And what I may do after shutting this down is look for the longbow video that I had thought I had and play it for you.